them. Thank you, Molly. I had that down and then I didn't press the button. This is what a team is good for. Awesome. FYI, as you know, then we're being recorded. So welcome to this recording, which you can access later. And some of you who have been around for the last few weeks might notice that you can access these at the ELCA Youth Ministry Network webpage. So all of these recordings are available after today, if perhaps you want to share them with other staff members or other folks also. So I see y'all are using the chat box, which is awesome. Thank you for doing that. And now I'm going to introduce our three panelists today. And I'm going to invite each one of the three of them to tell us their name, their pronoun, where they're coming from, and how they're related to the ELCA and LGBTQ ministry. So I'll let any of the three of them choose to go first.
This is always a running battle between Daniel and I in any panel that we're on, because we will both always go first. So we just make eye contact with each other until one of us unmutes. My name's Kelsey Brown. I serve as the pastor of Jehu Bible in East New York, also known as Brooklyn, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
I'm Jaden. I go by they, them pronouns, and I'm an alumni of the Naming Project. Yeah.
Thanks, Jaden. Good to meet you. I haven't met you before, so great to be with you. My name is Daniel Kirschbaum. I serve as the program director for young adult ministry at the Churchwide office. I live in Colorado Springs, and I most recently was working at Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp in Colorado. So a lot of what I share today probably will be more reflective of outdoor ministry settings. But it's good to be with you all. I use he, they pronouns, if that's new for some of you. It's an expansive use of pronouns, so I'm comfortable with he and they. Some folks using he, they, or she, they have a preference. I don't, but feel free to use either of those pronouns for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel and Kelsey and Jaden. So glad for y'all to be here. And this, I was telling our three panelists earlier that this has been a fantastic group over the last 3 weeks, and a really safe space for, I feel, Ross to talk honestly. And we just pray that you would also offer the same safety to this group too, and speak in a place, coming from a place of appreciativeness for their vulnerability and their willingness to speak with us today. So we appreciate that. And so let's move forward with a word of prayer, if you would. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this sacred time together. Over the next hour, we appreciate your spirit moving and guiding us, opening our hearts, opening our ears. Help us to truly listen to one another, that we might more and more become the church that you have asked us to be, the people of God that you call us to be, the kingdom of inclusivity that means the reign of God is near. So help us to do that, God. Thank you so much for our panelists, and thank you for your presence among us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm going to lead with some questions. And again, as usual, feel free to put questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to them when we can. I'm going to read a question and then any three of our panelists can jump in and help answer it. So here goes our first one. What does it mean for a congregation or ministry to be welcoming of LGBTQ teens? Thanks again.
Is somebody else talking?
Go for it,
No?
Jade.
Okay. I have written down for physically being welcoming, like flags, being advocates publicly on platforms, going to like events that are hosted for and by people of the LGBTQ community, and making it known that they are there in support and they are allies. Also, like within churches, like sermons about love and like what Jesus said and how love thyself as I have loved you, and love others as I have loved you. And like, I think that that's the most important thing, is just really just making it clear from the get-go that you are an ally instead of being subliminal.
That's so helpful. Yeah, I appreciate that from the get-go. Thank you, Jaden.
I will also say that people that are not members of the LGBTQIA plus community, you can call yourself an ally, but your work to the community is what people will see and say, oh, that's an ally. It's very easy to put that hat on of like, I love everyone, and church does that really well. But until you are kind of seen as someone who goes and actually supports some of the things that Jaden is kind of lifting up, then the community can actually see what type of allyship you're kind of willing to participate in. I know in my faith community, the congregation known as Jehu's Table, one of our biggest things has been honoring folks' pronouns and not making assumptions about people's gender expression or identity or sexual orientation based on how they dress. I come from an African descent Lutheran church, and I come from an African descent Lutheran church by birth. So there's frequently conversations of like, you can't tell someone's gender expression or sexual orientation by like if they have a skirt on in worship. And we do a lot of like sister so-and-so and brother so-and-so in my church. And I am constantly reminding folks that sibling is also a great way to refer to people, especially people that we don't know, and that sometimes using honorifics in a church space can exclude rather than include.
Thanks, Jaden and Kelsey. I would just add really briefly some pieces. I think creating space for those pronouns and sharing is important. That could look like in a youth group sharing that, but that also could look like at the beginning of a worship service or into passing of the peace, inviting people to share those with their neighbor, or if your name tags have a space for that. But there's some structural pieces that maybe feel like, oh, we're adding all these things in, but those kind of concrete spaces for people to be welcomed are really important, I think. Flags are cool. Your welcome statement being visible and clear about what is welcome and what's not welcome in your space can make it feel safe. I've been in congregations where they let me know where bathrooms are right away and what availability for bathrooms. And if there's not a gender neutral bathroom option, just naming that really early, and like, it's okay that your church isn't there maybe structurally right away because of how it was built and things like that, but being really honest about those things, I think, is really important too.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm making a good note list. That was really helpful. All three of you. Thank you. Our next question. What do you say to leaders whose congregations or ministries are nervous to have the conversation about inclusivity? What do you say to leaders who are nervous about the conversation around inclusivity?
I can start with that one. I think that nervousness can often come from a couple places. One, it can come from like, I don't want to say the wrong thing and I don't want to offend. And I think that's a really common place for that nervousness to start from. I would say to that your like lack of beginning the work on inclusivity is more offensive than you stumbling over language, and being really clear that you're trying and to really open and welcome feedback and to honor anger if that comes out of stumbling over language and things like that. The other piece is that it can come from, like if we include some folks, are we going to exclude other folks? And I think that's a real space that can come, that conversation can come. I in no way like to encourage more polarization in our world and society right now. And I think that there's some really good language around like what behavior is not acceptable. So like, right, like your behavior that is discriminatory or demeans or doesn't love people well. I think the language of loving people well can be helpful for folks who maybe are still really working through their own reconciliation of faith and sexuality and gender expressions and the diversity of all those things. And so I think naming where that nervousness comes from is really important because that'll help you approach how to work through that. Like what actually is nervousness there? Is it just like lack of comfortability? In which case you can say, welcome to being a Lutheran church in a rooted history of Reformation and pushing against things that are uncomfortable.
I have to say, like, along with that nervousness and not knowing what to say, talk to people who are in the communities that you are advocating for and that you are like helping to include. Talk to them because we are going to be more accepting to people actually asking questions than just assuming what to say. Also, people are gonna be upset and people are gonna leave hate. It's kind of inevitable in the world we live in, but in retrospect, you're gonna be saving more lives and giving more people hope than people leaving. Like you are going to be giving children and teenagers who have been abused and cast out from multiple places an actual place where they can feel comfortable, and that could save their life.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Jaden. When I have conversations with folks, I frequently try to remind them that this is a life or death situation. And it is. It's not to be polarizing. It's not to be too intense, although at times I can be both of those things for the side of justice. But it actually matters a lot. I think more so, like Jaden is suggesting, than folks that are uncomfortable. I also like to remind people that the folks that we are including are also nervous to be excluded, and that there is naming all of that nervousness, all of the things that are in the room is also really helpful in like encouraging people to take a breath instead of reacting upon first experiences, some of the nervousness that Daniel is pointing to. And I think that it's really important to allow all folks the space to kind of express that as long as it's not harming anyone. Because nervousness for the sake of nervousness is fine. I am an anxious person all the time. But nervousness when you're projecting that as anger onto someone that you're trying to welcome is not the best. And Jesus shows us those experiences, right, in his conversations with the folks on the margins all the time, is that the disciples have real discomfort in who Jesus is reaching out to, but Jesus continues to do it. So
Pastor Kelsey, preach. That was good. All of that was good. No excuses for our nervousness. Thank you for calling us out, all of you, on that. In your experience, what is the intersection between race and LGBTQ inclusivity? So that intersectionality question around, and you can speak about your experience in particular or experiences you see in the public eye. What is the intersection between race and LGBTQ inclusivity?
I'll start, Kelsey. Well, yeah, I'll start, and then you can, exist as your answer. I think there's a couple pieces. But the first is that, like, when we're doing equitable practices for folks on the margin, for like a specific group, that is making it more welcoming for everybody, not just other folks on the margin, but our majorities as well, right? So like our work towards anti-racism actually makes spaces more open for white folks as well. Our folks in Queer Liberation actively makes those spaces more welcoming and whole for our cis and straight folk. And that's not saying that it's like for those people, but the reality of doing welcoming and equitable work for some folks is that it does make it more welcoming and equitable for others. And the reality of that is we're inviting God's whole presence in the diversity of all that God has made to be welcome into the space, and that helps everybody in the space show up more like themselves. There is some intersections, and Kelsey might talk to these a little bit, or Jaden might talk to these a little bit too, right? Around like historic cultural experience with queer liberation from folks of color. And so there's like some tension there, actually. It's not just like they go hand in hand beautifully and we like walk down the street happy together all the time. In fact, that there's some hard tension from folks of color around queer liberation and queer theology and queer inclusivity. And so that's something to like know, and to not just always put those two things in the same space, and to know that often folks who have a heart for inclusivity and for some of our liberation work, right, like navigate those spaces simultaneously. And that does sometimes help, and then sometimes also works against what we're working on.
Jaden, you can add if you have something.
Oh, I was gonna wait for you.
Oh, all right.
I think your voice is important. So
I think your voice is just as important. So last year during the pandemic, or even honestly, who even knows what time is anymore, 2 years ago before the pandemic, the ELCA celebrated 50, 40, 10. And those were the numbers that were thrown out all over everything. Ooh, 50 years since women's ordination, 40 years since Black women's ordination, 10 years for LGBTQIA plus folks. In the midst of that celebration, I was waiting for first call. And Black women in the ELCA wait on average 3 years after graduating seminary for a first call. When you add on another hat of being LGBTQIA+, that extends your wait. I'm a lifelong Lutheran. I made various connections in the ELCA through working at Lutheran summer camps, on my synod council in high school, all of these things. And I still sat and waited while my classmates who had the same degrees, both undergraduate and graduate, that I had calls before graduation. We are remiss when we act as if the intersections are not in the room. And it's also really important, I think, to acknowledge that when we celebrate one group of folks, we also have to take a minute to look at who is not being celebrated. It's not enough to say 50 years ago, all women were able to become ordained in the ELCA. And instead, it is important to acknowledge that Black women waited 10 years longer for that same privilege. And then LGBTQIA plus folks had to create a completely different system before 2009 and even after. I serve on the board of directors for Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, who created the extraordinary candidacy process and worked very hard to push things in the right direction for the Lutheran Church at large. And one of the conversations that we have frequently at the table is, how are we acknowledging the intersections in the room, and then how are we as an organization approaching each instance with an anti-racist lens? Those are hard questions. Those are hard things to do, especially in the ELCA, but they're conversations that are worthwhile They're conversations that need to be happening. I can't bifurcate my identity at any time to say, well, today I'm just Black, or today I'm just a queer person. My mom is white, so some days I benefit from the privilege of having a parent that is non-Black. All of those things create who I am as a person and who I am as a pastor in the ELCA. So when we're looking at welcome statements, as Daniel mentioned prior, Reconciling Works, who helps congregations become reconciling Christ, they have started to put new parameters on what those welcome statements look like in regards to race, because it's not enough to just welcome the LGBTQIA plus community if that's just white folks. It is not enough to welcome trans folks into congregations knowing that Black trans women are murdered at extremely high rates all throughout our country just for existing. All of those things have to be looked at to then turn, as Jaden said so eloquently, into those messages of love others the way that Jesus has loved us. And sometimes that love looks like giving really hard truths to folks. And hoping that they can take those truths and then turn them into action and into love and into grace and all of those really big Lutheran buzzwords that we love to throw around.
I would like to add that in the media, what LGBTQ representation is, it's very cis, gay, white men. That's very much what I see. There is not a lot of representation outside of that. Maybe a sprinkle of a lesbian woman, but not much. You know, I am still sitting here waiting to see a non-binary, polyamorous, pansexual, trans Black woman. Like I'm waiting to see that, and it's not happening. And it's very, very frustrating because so many communities are being misrepresented as being only gay white men. And not to mention the rooted racism within the LGBTQ community. It's very, very white centered, very, very Euro-centered. There is a lot of racism, and we often forget that the people who fought the most at Stonewall riots were Black trans women. They were right there fighting for our rights to exist. And now it's 2021 and it still feels like they're not getting the justice they deserve. And like, I'm sitting here, my heart is like beating really fast because I'm getting mad talking about it. Talking about how these people fight so hard every single day and they're not recognized for the work that they put in or the work that their ancestors put in. Their grandparents, their parents, their moms, their dads, their just everybody. And we don't talk about it. It's like almost non-existent in a lot of places. Most LGBTQ Facebook groups don't really talk about the racism or how we need to lift up POC voices. It's not really there. Occasionally there's a post where like, oh, if you're a person of color, talk about your experiences. But we need that daily. We don't need it once a month. We need it every single day, all the time, so that these voices are truly heard. And we need to listen to what they're saying instead of talking over them, because there's a lot of that too. That's what I have to add.
Thank you. I really appreciate everything y'all are saying. It's hard to move on to another question because I'm still intrigued with everything you're saying, but let's get to a little practical here maybe. What's your favorite go-to resource for queer ministry? What is your favorite go-to resource for queer ministry.
I have a book I'm going to share, but I'm trying to find an Instagram handle for you to follow too. So I'm going to share the book, and then while other people talk, hopefully find Instagram. The book I want to share with you to look at is a starting place. It is not perfect, and it is older, but it is the beginning of thinking around queer theology, as especially I think that there's a little bit of a movement from caring about like specific Bible verses. You might have older folks as you like do inclusivity work that want to talk about that, but like younger folks care about the message of God and God's people more than they care about like what Leviticus like 18:22 says, right? Like they maybe don't have every one of that memorized or care at all. So the book I want to share with you is called Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics. I'll put it in the chat. But it starts talking about queer theology in a way that we're not apologizing for queer theology, like not in the context of like, oh, well, we're the denomination that is inclusive of folks, and we're like sorry that you don't agree, and like, but it instead starts from a place of this is holy and sacred love and existence, and moves from there as a starting place. And Molly put that link in. If somebody has a non-Amazon link from one of our private booksellers or smaller nonprofit booksellers that they want to share, or I think there's one in Chicago that I just heard about like yesterday that some Black women. So if someone wants to put a link in there that folks can find it in a non-Amazon setting. But if Amazon is what's accessible to you in your area, that is a real piece of more intersectionality. So there's options for you. And I'll get that Instagram handle while Kelsey and Jaden share some resource.
I too am going to suggest 2 books for you. I always joke with my partner that being a pastor, my book collection never stops growing, even if I stop reading the books that I've had for 10 years. I just got this book. It's called What's God Like by Rachel Held Evans and Matthew Paul Turner. I see Anne-Marie, who is a dear friend of mine, frantically searching for her copy. It's brilliant. Not only is the illustration really fantastic, but the images that are depicted depict folks of all types. And I think it's a really accessible way to get kids to start thinking about what God is to them in this expansive way of who God could be to all people. So again, that's called What is God Like? I really like it because it's not like, what does God look like? What is God? It is so much more about like, what is God to you and how God shows up. Even for youth, I read it in Bible study this week to my all adult, all female Bible study, and they were obsessed and all want copies for themselves. So that is a youth book that I would maybe suggest. And then there is a book called Dear God, I'm Gay, Thanks. It's by Joel Werkin. Joel Werkin was influential in the Berkeley movement of LGBTQIA plus inclusivity in the church, and unfortunately passed away before being able to see the strides that the church has made, as well as some of the blunders that the church has made in being accepting. And when I was coming out and trying to compartmentalize, like, can I be a Christian and also be queer, I was able to get that book passed on to me by actually a dear friend of Joel's, and now it is a prized copy in my book collection. It is older, so language has changed, but I would definitely recommend it wholeheartedly, especially for like adults, teens, late teens.
I will say that I don't really have any books. I don't have time to read anymore. I'm a high school student going into college, so like that's not really something that I can do. But what I the camp I went to, the naming project, being here for that reason, I will say that that is a great place to go. My experience there was incredible. And I made some friends that I am still in contact with today. And while I may not go to church as much as I used to, if churches were run like that camp, I would go every day gladly because it felt so inclusive. I felt like my voice was heard and I had a place to be in a place of religion because that's not something I really feel in the town that I live in or the towns around me. So I will say that is a great place for teenagers to go, but that's all I have.
That's awesome. I'm so glad the naming project exists and that you were a part of it and you're willing to be here. What is your number one tip or piece of advice for ministry with LGBTQ teens? So if you had one tip and you've named some like really great practical things, all of you, and maybe it's one of those things, but you have our ear, several people who are in charge of running ministry with teens. So if we were to walk away with that one thing that would make a difference, what would that tip be?
My number one tip would be vulnerability with boundaries. I think as a camp person, and I wonder if Daniel feels this way too, I was an oversharer at camp because I felt as though it really helped the youth and young adults that I was journeying alongside to feel comfortable enough to give their full self or the things that they were kind of hiding away in conversation with me. And I got in trouble, not like legal trouble, but I got in trouble because I wasn't able to continue the boundary between like I am an adult camp professional and although I am a queer person, I am not your friend. And I think that there are frequently blurry lines in youth and young adult ministries of like, okay, well, you're talking to me like a friend would, so but then you're telling me you're not my friend. And I think that when we share pieces of ourselves, particularly for me as an LGBTQIA plus person, a member of that community, that I have to remember that we can give vulnerability, we can support from a place that is rooted in being vulnerable with one another, but that maintaining the boundary of I am not your friend and I will guide you and support you as well as I can, and leaving space for that. Also, I am pretty envious of the naming project. I would have been a very different person, perhaps, if I had encountered the naming project. I did encounter my church camp, and that was also formative. But I think that pointing people in the direction of folks that can do more than you can is the good thing to do as like an adult leader. It's like I don't have all the answers, but I can point you to someone that may have more answers than me. And I think that youth and young adults really appreciate that because at times as a pastor, I feel like I'm just making things up. Like I'm like, "Oh, I actually know someone that knows much more than I do. Let me please point you to them and not to me who's trying to help with the very few resources that I have." So pointing people, take away the power. It doesn't have to be, I know people frequently feel like my youth program, my youth ministry is my baby. It's like, all right. If you don't know what you're doing, someone else can. And if it is a queer person, a trans person, a person of color, a non-white person, pay them money for their time, resources, and the ability to be in conversation with them, because it is work, but necessary work.
My advice is just ask questions. That's like the biggest thing. Just ask questions. If that person doesn't have an answer, like Pastor Kelsey said, point them into the direction of somebody who might have the answer. You know, if you don't know how to be inclusive with pronouns, ask somebody who uses different pronouns than she, her, or he, him. Ask someone. If you don't know how to make trans people feel comfortable with the bathrooms, ask the trans person how the church can accommodate to make them feel comfortable. It's not difficult to do it. And I think that people, again, are just so nervous to say the wrong thing. Don't be nervous to say the wrong thing. We will correct you and we won't get upset. It's so simple, and it's also very scary. It's also scary for us, you know, being largely teenagers who are going to churches who are out. I think it's so scary for us to answer these questions and feel safe. So just like approach us gently, please. Don't like come up to us and be like, how can we do this? And just be like, hey, can we have a conversation and maybe talk about some things to make everybody feel comfortable here and make everybody feel like they are welcome and they are included in the conversation.
Yeah, I would say my tip, I think the reality of gender and sexuality diversity is that you're like often talking about like how people exist, bodies, and like who, like all vulnerable things just for teenagers in general, right? Like those are just like generally vulnerable topics unrelated to any sort of marginalization or like experiencing the world in a different way. And so I think being really like gentle, but I think Kelsey's piece about boundaries is helpful in that there are like helpful things to talk about in spaces, and then there are things where it's like, okay, this is like a therapist conversation, maybe not your youth director conversation, and like how do we resource and equip folks to have that conversation. I also think my biggest tip would be that like parents might not be on the same page as their children, and your role, I understand you have like a responsibility to church, but there's also like a gospel responsibility, and so there's some tension to navigate there with honoring humans that say where they're at no matter what age they are, and walking with parents, and that might be getting parents resources too, and really helping parents be a resource. And so yeah, I would say the piece about you not always being the right person, I think as a camp person I always wanted to be like the person the kid connected with, and I would imagine that that is probably something folks in youth ministry and feel as well. But you might not always be the person, and equipping your congregation to be options to be that person, I think is a really powerful piece of what you get to do.
Great. All right. Well, we have one question left on my list, and then I see we already have some questions coming in the chat box, and so we're going to get to those in just a minute. So people feel free to start putting stuff in the chat box, and we'll get to those right after this one. The last one I have is, other than a rainbow flag in the front yard, what's the best way for a ministry to be public about their inclusion of LGBTQ young people or people in general? So other than just putting a rainbow flag in the church's front yard, perhaps, what's the best way or for people to be public about the inclusion?
I'm just going to start really quickly and say it's shocking to me in our theology that the churches aren't actually like the hub of equipping their community to be inclusive to LGBTQ folks, right? Like, what does it look like for a congregation not to be like, oh, we just made a new welcome statement, but to be like, hey, community center, our congregation members and church staff have put really a ton of effort into queer affirming practices, and we'll be offering 3 workshops over the next month to on like gender 101 and how to use, right? Like, what does it look like for the church to actually be the resource rather than the church need to find the resources? And like, that's how much you're owning it. That's like down like a farther spot in the journey for some folks, maybe, but maybe is like a goal to like quickly rise to.
For me, other ways to be public of inclusion, do your research about certain things, like possibly rates of homelessness, rates of, trigger warning. I don't know if I need this, but trigger warning, suicide. Rates of that, because those are very high. Rates of abuse, rates of relationship abuse. Looking at those and doing your research over them, understanding where they come from, and then making statements about them, and then acting upon those statements and what the church can do in their part to help solve the problem, whether that be providing shelter for LGBTQ youth who have been kicked out of their homes, providing possible free therapy for teens who are contemplating taking their life, providing food, providing, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Providing just the resources for them to feel comfortable. If they need clothes to affirm their identity, that would be great, because I know of tons of people who get rid of clothes daily and just like throw them away or give them to Goodwill. Maybe you could donate those clothes to a church, and those churches could give them out to the teens who need them to feel affirmed in themselves. I think that would be great to show your advocacy and your allyship to our community, is doing your research and then acting upon what you can do to prevent some of these things from happening. Giving numbers to call for abuse as well, if you are being abused in a relationship. And that goes for all identities and sexualities, of course, not just LGBTQ, but yeah, I think that would be great. Also, put more flags out. Put a trans flag out, a non-binary flag, an asexual flag. Put more than just the rainbow flag. There's so many of us, and there's so many flags that also cover so many of the other, small groups under those big labels. I think that would be very, very important.
One of my favorite things when I got to my current congregation, they had a large banner outside that was rainbow, but then it said within the banner, like, we welcome all people, and then listed, like, unchurched, left the church, coming back, LGBTQIA+, all of these things. And then I walked in and they weren't there. It was almost as if they put the banner up or the flag up because they thought that's what they should be doing. But then were misgendering trans folks or excluding people from sitting with them at coffee hour and things like that. And I was like, but you have this sign outside. And then I started having conversations. I did a Zoom, as Daniel suggested, about like pronouns 101. What does it mean to be reconciling in Christ, and why does it matter? Conversations like that. Also, one of my biggest joys is we have a person in our congregation that is in charge of the announcements every week. It is one person, and she curates the most beautiful announcements. and she uses pieces that are going on in the world and in the community in these announcements. So for Pride Month, she had a full slide about Stonewall and about why it matters to us specifically as a African descent worshiping community in New York, why Pride and Stonewall matter, right? Having conversations about trans kids playing sports, being able to say, these are announcements, these are things that we as this community should care about. And maybe you don't know this information because you're not plugged into these circles, but I'm going to provide you with this information because when you know better, you do better. And that was incredibly helpful and something that I hadn't seen at congregations that I had served in the past. Typically, even as the pastor, announcements are boring. Like, I'm like, I just wait for people to get up. I'm not usually trying to say the announcements. If I do, I feel like I'm going to forget one. So being able to have this one person who really cares enough to include, and it's not just, as Jaden said, it's not just LGBTQIA folks that need to be kind of uplifted, and doing things for disability awareness, mental health and mental illness awareness month. All of those things help things become less taboo in our congregations. And when we take away kind of the fear that is behind some of that exclusion, we open up the doors for more people to say, oh, I just heard this pastor preach about mental health. I think I'm going to come back here. Or I saw this announcement about Stonewall in a church on Sunday. I think I may come back here. And it's not about membership, although as a pastor, I want more people to be able to come to a church like my church than a church that doesn't include and rather excludes. But creative opportunities, both with the community and within our own congregations, to put our advocacy where our mouths and money are.
Great, that's great. We have 10 minutes left, and so we're getting more and more questions, so I'm afraid we're not going to get to all of them. So I'm going to ask just one of our panelists to answer when I ask a question. And so we can just try to get through as many as we can. So the first question we had from Serena, I think Jaden kind of already answered this one about, can you share thoughts about how or whether traditional social justice issues like homelessness and feeding programs is a good way to enter into conversation with LGBTQ youth? And I think Jaden pretty much said yes, since that's where the vulnerable are, go there. So I'm gonna hope, Serena, that answered your question. Sarah has a question. As a leader in the church, what are some signs that it's time to leave your church rather than to stay and try to make the congregation more welcoming, assuming that safety is not an issue? I'm going to throw that to Pastor Kelsey.
Is that, am I starting with that, or
yeah, Pastor Kelsey, as a leader in the church, what are some signs that it's time to leave your church rather than stay and try to make the congregation more welcoming?
Maybe I'm not the best person to answer this question, because I can get away with saying anything I want at Jehu's table, and they're going to be like, that's my pastor. So maybe I'm not that person. However, I will say, while I was on internship, I was on an internship that I was specifically selected for being a queer person. It was an initiative within the ELCA to have a congregation that they could not just include queer folks, that they would make this internship kind of set up for us. And while I was there, I experienced a great amount of racism, particularly a racist incident that I was attacked verbally at. And I was new, and this parishioner was a longstanding parishioner. And I said, all right, what are we gonna do about this? Luckily, that person ended up leaving, and I didn't have to handle any of it. However, I will say that there comes a time in the conversation where you have to weigh the pros and the cons. If the pro of opening the door and telling someone, this is what we stand for here. This is what the gospel invites us to stand for here. And there are many churches where that is not the case. Jesus will find you at one of those churches. Is the appropriate response, like is the correct response. If you're preaching the gospel, if you're teaching the people, if you're experiencing the joys, highs and lows of ministry, and your congregation is also experiencing that, except for a small few, Jesus will meet them where they are at a different place that is not the place that you are at. If it's your whole congregation is not at a place where you, the pastor, are at in regards to inclusivity, and it's not harming you, but has the potential to harm others, I would say talk to your bishop's office. I would say talk to Reconciling Works and Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries and figure out in discernment if it is the correct time for you to leave, or because you can only fight so much. I'm not going to fight with people about my existence. I'm just going to take my gifts and go somewhere else. That's hard. I'm not saying it's easy to do, but I've gotten to a place in my identity that I'm not apologizing for being born and like living on the planet anymore.
Thank you, Pastor Kelsey. I see that Ross is with us today, and so I see one little last question, and I'm going to try to answer that and then see if Ross does want to say anything as we close out, whether we want to or not. But the last question I saw was about pride and about different religious groups being present there, and the RIC groups having a booth, and kind of wondering like what the role is. And I think Ross addressed that perhaps what it was last week, saying that what I heard him say was, be present, be authentic, and don't use it as an advertisement, but truly be engaged, and then that's fine. So I think that's pretty much where we stand on that. I'm going to invite Ross if you'd like to share any thoughts before we close out today.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative, first of all, to the panel today. I know I dropped in late and I caught most of it, but thank you so much to Daniel and Kelsey and Jaden for sharing your wisdom. I know when we put this together, there's no way no one wants to listen to me for that long, so we needed other voices, and you were the voices that were absolutely needed to be heard, and that was being affirmed and confirmed in the chat. And I love to the resources that you're naming and identifying as well. I hope this is, even as we're ending out this particular initiative, I would also let folks know at the ELCA and at the Youth Ministry Network what you thought of it. I think this was kind of new as a format. They use my book as a way to do it, and I'm very flattered of that, but I also know that we could be doing this for all the books that you all named and other stuff too. So I say thank you, and I'm excited to keep working with you all, and we'll all go from here. And I think Molly is putting together a nice resource doc that has taken every single link that we have mentioned over the last 3 weeks, and I'm excited to have that be compiled into one thing that we can share.
Great. Thank you, Ross. That being said, buy, made, known, loved. Pass it around, talk to your bishop if they haven't heard about it yet, Synod assemblies, all those kinds of things. It's just a real keeper and a game changer for us. But what I also heard from our panelists, and Jaden too, especially, was ask. And I did hear that in Ross's book repeatedly too. So let's not be nervous, people. Let's not find excuses anymore. Let's ask the questions. Let's read the book. Let's be in conversation. Thank you to our panelists, like Ross said, for their giving of their time and their vulnerability, especially a high schooler with us today. It's very generous. And I'd just like to close with the word of prayer. Loving God, thank you for this time, this holy time. May it sink deep within us. May it become nutrients for our bodies that we might live in love in new ways. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much to everyone for making this special time in your week. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.